Welcome to the Fearless Security Standard of Practice in Context, Part 1, Examples from Recent Events webinar. The date here is actually a week off. We had originally planned this to be last week, but for one reason or another, it got moved. This is an outline of what we're going to discuss today, starting with the context. So fear, uncertainty, and doubt is, what Fearless is about getting rid of. An example of this is the attacker only has to be right once. We hear this lots and lots of time. Examples: one SQL injection attack gets the whole database, or one user error gains unlimited entry with a Trojan horse. One person accidentally clicks on the wrong thing or accepts an email, and now the bad guys are in and they can spread throughout the network. It's the GUI center. They got through the hard shell. The attacker can scan forever until they succeed. This is a common notion, and attackers do use large-scale scanning to try to do intelligence. And the attacker doesn't have to worry about going to jail. So it's actually a big boost if you're going to break the law, if you don't have to worry about going to jail. That nobody's going to come by to arrest you. But I think facts bring clarity, and ignorance is really not bliss, especially in this area. So in fact, of course, attackers have to be right lots of times. If your protective scheme is well architected, you detect and interdict long before they find anything important. And certainly that's what we expect out of our infrastructures. An example: what if an SQL injection only gets a small part of the database? Whatever they do to do the injection, if they can only get to a small part of the database, the consequences are limited and you have more time. And then they have to be right again and again and again to get more and more. What if no user can do more than so much harm? Now, this is a simple matter of limiting risk aggregation so that you don't grant authority to one individual, for example, to change all the routers in your infrastructure or disable all access to all systems. A lot of identity management systems have a centralized power mechanism without adequate protection, and some have decentralized mechanisms and protection, so making better decisions. What if the scans that they're using take a long time and don't succeed, right? Then the attacker, they can scan forever and they get nothing of use. And what if we arrest and prosecute them? Well, maybe that's just a pipe dream, but in fact, you see it around the world, people that are doing these large-scale worms and attacks are getting arrested and prosecuted in increasing numbers, and the penalties are quite severe. This, I guess, was long ago in England. They increased the severity of the penalties for pickpocketing because they couldn't catch them all, but they could penalize them. And it was never all that successful in stopping pickpockets because of the economic conditions. But nevertheless, it's an approach to take. My view is it's all about leverage and working together for the common good, and I'll explain that. We use a standard of practice approach. Our standard of practice is not a standard. That is, it's not something you follow. What it is, and it's not a practice, it's a set of reasonable and prudent practices. And the idea is that based on your situation, you choose practices that are reasonable and prudent for that situation. And it's intended to differentiate diligence from negligence. But I just want to be clear that just because our standard of practice says something is diligent or reasonable and prudent, it doesn't mean it's the only reasonable and prudent approach. There might always, be other approaches that work and that are reasonable and prudent and diligent. Also, it doesn't always apply. There are just situations that we can't anticipate in advance. It is open source. It's reviewed, and you can get there at all.net, which you go to the all.net, all.net website, and you click on protection. My system's a little bit slow today for whatever reason. And you look over here and you see standards of practice. And for example, I'm going to right click on enterprise protection to open the link in a new tab so we can see it all in one tab. Otherwise, it'll be down on the bottom of the screen here. And so here's the list of the elements of the standard of practice. And you can see there are about 110 of them. And pick an example: physical separation, how are zones physically separated and controlled. And each element of the standard of practice has a set of options. That is, alternatives associated with the decision-making process. It has a decision. In this particular case, the decision is based on high consequence, medium consequence, and low consequence situations. Scrolls a little bit too quickly. And then at the bottom, we have the basis, which is the details of what all these different things mean and why that decision is a rational decision. So, and it's that way for all the 100 plus items, decisions that have to be made. We use the standards of practice to help our experts do things, to make better decisions, to ask comprehensive questions, to use a common language so that we're always talking about the same words when there's no misimpressions. And it also helps to have these predefined decisions because, even no matter how much you don't remember everything there is to know about these 100 plus things. It's good to have something that identifies the possibilities you might have missed. And when it works, of course, we use it, but when it doesn't, we adapt it and update it. And you see this all the time. We've made several updates in the last month to reflect changes in the events of the world and the understandings that we have and new technologies that come out and changes in the threat environment and so forth. It is what it is because of some fundamental notions. The notion is that there's a finite set of alternatives for a finite number of decisions. So instead of trying to collect all data about everything all the time and find out everything there is to know, you use the finite alternatives for the finite decisions to drive data collection based on what you need to decide. And then, of course, we try to study history in order to predict the future. So we sort of assume notionally that the world isn't going to dramatically change in an instant. And it hasn't really historically, despite some of the claims you hear about black swans. We'll talk about that in a second. But also we want to try to be generic and deal with classes of things instead of instances. And that's why, excuse me, that's why in any particular instance, there might be differences. And that's why you need experts in order to do this properly. You can't just take it as a rote decision process and follow it, because there'll be cases where it's just flat wrong. There are almost no black swans in security. I'll say 99.999% or more of the attacks that we see are not new. The same methods, the same techniques again and again. Trojan horses are Trojan horses, perception management, it's the same thing. They may change a couple words about how they lie to you to try to get you to click on something, but they're still lying to you to try to get you to click on something and so forth. And by the way, we know how to defeat all of them, and we've done so for years. Not just us, but the world at large. The thing is, there are costs to defense, and that remains an issue. What we need to do is practice what we already know how to do, right? And to do that, we need decision making and execution, and those are the key issues we actually face in having more effective protection today, in my opinion. So let's talk about applying the standard of practice. Here's some examples. And the reason for this particular webinar is to sort of get at the things that you see in the environment today. Recent statistics, hackmageddon.com is a wonderful site. They have all sorts of examples of attacks and some limited details on what goes on in statistics. It really has a good collection to look at, and it's worth looking at to get a sense of what's going on. But it's not a scientific process. But regardless of those scientific limitations, most of the events that they actually find out about involve malicious inputs or human factors. And, the malicious input is SQL injection. Any remote vulnerability is some malicious input. DNS poisoning is another example of causing malicious input. Brute force, what they're talking here about is password guessing. Typically, it's not really brute force. They're not just trying all the passwords. They're usually using dictionary attacks and so forth. Those are malicious input. Human factors and deception is account hijacking. Most so-called targeted attacks involve taking advantage of human factors and so forth. So over time, the difference between high and low consequence has been, and I believe will continue to be, risk aggregation. Typically, when you put a lot of weight on something that really can't handle the weight, when you put a lot of records in a database that's not well protected, and when I say well protected, I mean it's a low surety system. You're running a version of Windows with patching and have a couple of protective measures in place. That's just not enough. And then when you pile a lot of risk in it, when you put millions of credit card numbers in such a system and they get stolen, then the problem is you've put too many eggs in too few baskets. And if you start to look at this across enterprises, you find that typically the authorized levels for risk are much lower than the actual aggregated risk that they're putting into these systems or that they're placing on people. So, the examples, why does an SQL injection reveal the whole database? There's just no real reason it should do that, right? you could make it so that the worst case SQL injection could release 500 or 1,000 records or something like that. And instead of losing them, 50 million at a time, you'll lose them more slowly. And maybe by the time, you get up to a few thousand, you'll start to notice it. Why do remote vulnerabilities lead to long-term access? There's really no reason they have to lead to long-term access. Maybe you can have short-term access because somebody found some vulnerability and got in. But when you repair it, if you don't somehow mitigate the damage that was done, you're missing, the boat. Why does gaining user access ever lead to high consequences? Why should there be any user in your environment that on their own can produce high consequences, or any two or three? Presumably, in order to get to the high consequences, you need more than just user level access. You need some higher level of authority. So the ability to expand authority is another big problem. And why do any small number of targets lead to massive harm? It's the same thing. There's this aggregation of risk surrounding these things. And I think the reason is because we fail to disaggregate the risk as a standard approach. I think we should always be looking to disaggregate risks. So this SOP, the standard of practice countermeasures, are not an accident, right? When we look at risk and understand what you can do on attack and defense, we try to produce countermeasures that address this. So the standard of practice doesn't work by accident. It's based on history. And think of it like the airline history, right? The airline industry, you find a flaw, defeat it, repeat. So this is why air traffic is so safe, because over the last 100 plus years, we find problems with airplanes or problems with pilots or problems with the system or manufacturing or whatever it is, and we fix it. But unlike the airline industry, in information protection, we fail to repeat and defeat. I kind of like that phrase. And this is actually a very interesting quote. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I put an asterisk here because it's often attributed to Edmund Burke from the 1700s, but I looked and was unable to find an actual quote. There's a slightly different form from George Santayana in The Life of Reason. This is from 1905. And then there are further ones after that. So lots of politicians have used similar phrases, but it's actually older than you think. So I think the point here is you need to read history, learn from history, and not repeat those mistakes. What the standard of practice does in some sense is try to codify the lessons of history and combine them with science, wherever we can get scientific results, and experience from many people in many places, and turn that into a set of known practical alternatives and decisions about when to use which of them. That's what we're trying to accomplish, and that's what we have accomplished to the extent we have. It's not attack specific. We never try to look at some specific attack that just happened and try to understand it, except in the context of history, or if it doesn't fit in the context of history, then we look at that as a change that requires an update to the way the world works. So classes of events, we want to leverage our decision-making process so it handles large classes of things. And the goal is to find a set of sound practices that are suitable for the various conditions that occur in the world. Reasonable and prudent, has a meaning. It's historically, it's subjective. It has to do with, reasonable care, what a prudent person would do. Same with due diligence, and the slides are going to be available so you can read the details later. In the context of the standard of practice, it's supposed to be applied by people with expertise. And so we're not talking about the reasonable and prudent person off the street and what they might do. We're talking about people with expertise in information protection and experience in the particular industry and so forth. What's reasonable and prudent for them to do. But just again, to reiterate, it's not the only reasonable and prudent practice. We're just identifying some things that we found to be reasonable and prudent by the combined opinions of the people that wrote it and the people that reviewed it and so forth. So here's an example of an SOP countermeasure. Malicious input is the problem we've identified. It's actually covered under many areas of the standard of practice. For example, content control deals with how is harmful and useless content controlled. And one of the elements under there is syntax checking. And it's required essentially at every level that you check information for syntax at input or at output, at the various places that you're going to use it. So just doing syntax checking and nothing else would eliminate almost all of the things like SQL injections, because the vast majority of SQL injections are things where instead of asking for one record, it asks for something that has an asterisk or some other character that's not in a normal query, or an asterisk standing alone instead of an asterisk in the middle of a larger query. And all you have to do is check the syntax, and you can eliminate those. Another one is logical perimeters. What logical perimeters have what protection mechanisms? Well, query limits and filters are something that go in logical perimeters. So again, it's limiting the queries that you can make to a database and filtering both the input and the output. Firewalls, right? You can use application specific input and output as a function of state controls at firewalls. It's very common in firewall technology today. Web application firewalls are an example of that. And then incident detection, just anomaly detection. If somebody pulls 50 million records from a database, you're probably going to see it. It's going to be a spike in traffic, and it's going to have various content that you don't normally see being pushed out the interfaces and so forth. So that's an example, where we have these, generic things that will work against lots and lots of things produced by malicious input. Human factors and deception, again, covered by many standard of practice elements. Management procedures, as an example. You have procedures that cover how user activities are carried out. So by having procedures in place, you make it so that you can't just have somebody go around the normal procedure. They actually can't do it that way. They have to go through the procedure or it won't get done. Security awareness, to be able to recognize key situations and respond in accordance with the plan. So, if you recognize that something might be going on, a deception or something, there's supposed to be a plan in place to deal with it. And you have to have your users aware of what the plan is and trained to recognize the situation and react to it properly. A trust model, right? You need a basis for trust limits affecting different parties. So it's hard for somebody to trick you into do something if you have a trust model that says that these people under this circumstance get trusted for this purpose. Because then you know that it doesn't matter what they asked for, it doesn't matter what they said. The trust model says, based on who they are and the circumstance, I'm really not allowed to do that. I mean, that's just how it is. You can escalate it, and that of course changes the dynamics, the amount of time and effort required, and whether it's successful. Workflows are another example. So if you're in anything other than the smallest business and you have any kind of reasonably systematic processes, you should have some sort of a workflow in place because you want to be able to do things again and again reliably. So what you do is you put limitations on who can do what and how in the workflows. And even if the workflows can be exploited, even if somebody exploits something about the workflows, there are still limitations on who can do what. And so you've reduced the set of things where deception can cause the process to go awry. Another one is deceptions, how you can use deceptions against the other guys. Content control, how do you limit intelligence gathering, and so forth. There are many of these elements of the standard of practice that address this. And finally, I just want to bring up the risk aggregation and interdependencies chunk of this. It's covered extensively, right? Risk management under risk aggregation. What process is used to identify and control the aggregation of risks? Duties, separation of duties is fundamental. So it shouldn't be that one individual can both specify who's going to be paid and then sign the check. This is, absolutely required in financial systems. And the same is true, specify and verification or specify and execute should have separation of duties in information technology so that even the CIO can't tell you, here's what you're going to do, and then go do it, right? Somebody has to say, here's what we want done, and somebody else has to do it. And then either a third party or the first party has to verify that it was done appropriately. That's a separation of duties. And of course, you can have more people involved for further separation depending on the risk levels involved. Interdependencies in supply chain management is another example in risk management. Real-time interdependencies. How do you zone the network, right? So by having a different zoning structure, you reduce the aggregation of risk so that, for example, content can't flow outside a zone or a subzone, or in some cases, a microzone. And so let's just talk for a minute about how those things we've talked about deal with the specifics of these attacks. Syntax checking, right? That'll stop almost all of the SQL injection attacks that you can identify. unless there's a legitimate reason for somebody to be able to pull the entire database of all the credit card information from a company. And even in that case, query limits and filters should take care of it, because presumably you don't let anybody anywhere pull the entire database. You have some set of people that are authorized to do it under some circumstances from some places. Application-specific input and output in state control, same thing. You should be able to block all but the appropriate sequences. Anomaly detection, I mentioned before. You see this enormous change in the pattern of traffic. That's going to let you know that something's going on. And any one of these would likely be effective, but if you combine them all together, then they're effective even when some of them start to fail. And that's when people talk about defense in depth, that's sort of what they're talking about, although perhaps they're not talking about it in the same terms. We look at account hijacking. So can they take over an account? Well, so training reduces the ability to do that through deception, but also workflow prevents many of the methods for taking control. So even if you should get control of some part of some portion of the process, that doesn't give you the full set of controls you need to do substantial harm. If they do, then the procedures limit the effect of any individuals, the separation of duties limits the effect of the individual, the workflows limit the effect of the individual, and so forth. So account hijacking can only get you so much and so far, and now you have to, hijack multiple accounts in the proper sequence, in the proper places, and not be detected by the various feedback mechanisms in place. Now, just to be clear, these things we're talking about, they're not explicitly defenses to defend against account hijacking or SQL injection. There's nothing about SQL injection or hijacking of accounts that these defenses indicate. They're generic, right? So the point is the standard of practice protects against large classes of things, and each of the common scenarios that you see in the world are only point examples of this. But if you apply the standard of practice and if you apply proper protective architecture, then you have redundant coverage against the whole class of things, not just the individual examples. So if you follow the standard of practice, it's really not a response-oriented process, although it does, of course, address response. It's proactive protection against large classes of event sequences, and that's the whole purpose. So, how is this different from any other standard? That's a really good question for next month. And so we're going to be talking about, how we're applying and adapting the standards and how you can apply them part 2.